There was a time when the land we now call Iran was not just part of history, it was history. Before the world had superpowers, before borders divided nations, there existed a civilization that didn't just grow, it dominated everything around it. They called it Persia, a land where kings didn't just rule cities, they ruled continents, where roads stretched for thousands of miles, connecting cultures that had never met before. Wikipedia.org, where power wasn't just measured in armies, but in ideas that would outlive empires. At its peak, this empire controlled nearly half of the known world. Wikipedia.org. Think about that for a moment. Half of everything people knew, but then, without warning, the strength began to fade. The empire that once stood unshakable started to crack from within, and slowly, the voice of Persia turned into silence. Yet today, something feels familiar. The world is watching this land again, not for what it has become, but for what it has always represented. Power, influence, and a story that refuses to end. So the real question is, are we witnessing history repeat itself, or are we just beginning to understand it? And before we go deeper, tell me, from where are you watching this video, and what time is it in your country, the land where empires were born? Long before it was known as Iran, long before borders were drawn and names were written into history, there existed a land that did not belong to any one people, yet somehow stood at the center of everything. It was not a kingdom, not an empire, and not even a unified nation. It was something far more raw, more ancient, and more powerful, a meeting point of worlds, where geography itself seemed to shape destiny. This land was vast and unforgiving, yet strangely alive. Towering mountain ranges rose like natural fortresses, protecting what lay within. Endless deserts stretched across the horizon, harsh and silent, testing anyone who dared to cross them. But hidden between these extremes were fertile valleys, flowing rivers, and pockets of life that quietly resisted the odds. It was a place of contrast, where survival demanded strength, patience, and adaptation. And it was in this environment that something extraordinary began to take form. Unlike other early civilizations that grew in isolation, this land was never truly alone. To the west lay Mesopotamia, where the first cities and written laws were beginning to shape human society. To the east, the Indus Valley thrived with its own advanced systems and culture, and between them, this land became a bridge, a silent connector of ideas, people, and movement. Traders passed through it, carrying goods and stories. Travelers crossed its paths, bringing knowledge from distant lands. Even conflict found its way here, leaving behind lessons carved into memory. At first, there was no unity here. The people who lived on this land were divided into tribes, each with its own customs, beliefs, and ways of life. Some settled near rivers and valleys, learning to cultivate the land and build small communities. Others remained nomadic, moving with the seasons, following animals, and adapting to the rhythms of nature. There were warriors among them, shaped by conflict and survival, and there were thinkers, quietly observing the world and passing down knowledge through generations. They were different in every possible way, and for a long time they remained separate. But something subtle was happening beneath this division. These tribes were not just coexisting, they were interacting. They exchanged tools, shared techniques, and observed each other's strengths. Over time, they began to learn, to adapt, and to grow. Without realizing it, they were creating something that no single tribe could have built alone. They were forming the foundation of a civilization, one that was not defined by isolation, but by connection. This was the true power of this land. It did not force unity, it allowed it to emerge naturally. It brought people together not through control, but through necessity and opportunity. And as generations passed, identities began to shift. The idea of belonging started to grow, not just within tribes, but across them. Symbols appeared, names gained meaning, and slowly, almost invisibly, a larger identity began to take shape. Among these many groups, one in particular began to stand out. They were not the strongest at first, nor the most dominant. They did not control vast territories, and they were not feared by neighboring powers. But they possessed something that others did not fully understand: a growing sense of unity, a shared direction, and an ability to adapt without losing their identity. They lived in a region known as Persia, a place that would one day give its name to something far greater than anyone could imagine. They were the Persians. At that time, however, they were just another group among many. To the great powers of the region, they were insignificant, almost invisible. Larger and more established empires looked at them without concern, believing that the balance of power would remain unchanged. But history has always had a way of hiding its most important moments in the quietest places. Because while the great civilizations of the world were focused on maintaining their dominance, something new was forming here, something different. This was not just another tribe seeking survival or expansion. This was the early stage of a transformation that would redefine power itself. The land, the people, and the conditions were all aligning in a way that had never happened before. And then, at the precise moment when no one expected it, when the world was least prepared, and when the Persians were still seen as nothing more than a minor presence, a single individual would rise from among them. Not born into overwhelming power, not backed by an unstoppable empire, but driven by something far more dangerous, a vision that went beyond tribe, beyond territory, and beyond tradition. He would not simply lead his people, he would unite them. He would challenge the greatest empires of his time, and he would build something so vast, so organized, and so influential that the world would never look the same again. And the moment that man stepped forward, everything changed. The man who changed everything. And the moment that man stepped forward, everything changed. At first, no one could see it. There were no signs in the sky, no sudden shifts in power, no immediate indication that history itself was about to turn. The world continued as it always had. Empires remained confident in their strength. Kings believed their thrones were secure, and the Persians were still seen as nothing more than a minor presence on the edge of greater civilizations. But change rarely announces itself loudly. It begins quietly, almost invisibly, and by the time the world notices, it is already too late to stop it. The man who would ignite this transformation was born into a world already dominated by powerful forces. To the north and west stood the Medes, a formidable empire that had already established its authority over large regions, including the Persians themselves. To the west, the Lydians controlled immense wealth, known for their gold and influence. And further beyond, Babylon stood as one of the greatest centers of power and culture the world had ever seen. These were not small kingdoms. These were giants, and against them the Persians were still considered insignificant. His name was Cyrus, not yet known as the Great, not yet feared, not yet remembered, just a young man born into a system where his people lived under the shadow of others. But even in those early years, there was something different about him, something that could not be easily explained. It was not just strength or intelligence, it was perspective. He did not see the world the way others did. Where most saw limits, he saw possibilities. Where others accepted division, he imagined unity. Stories would later be told about his early life, some filled with legend, others with fragments of truth. They spoke of danger surrounding his birth, of attempts to eliminate him before he could grow, as if even fate itself recognized the threat he posed to the existing order. Whether every detail is true or not, one thing is certain: Cyrus grew up understanding that power was not just inherited, it could be taken, reshaped, and redefined. As he matured, the situation around him became clearer. The Persians were not free. They were under the control of the Medes, expected to serve rather than lead. Many accepted this reality as unchangeable. It was simply the way the world worked. But Cyrus did not accept it. He observed, he learned, and most importantly, he waited, because he understood something that others did not. Power was not only about armies or wealth, it was about timing, loyalty, and belief. When the moment finally came, it did not arrive with chaos, it arrived with precision. Cyrus began to unite the Persian tribes, not through fear, but through trust. He gave them something they had never fully had before, a shared identity, a purpose greater than survival. He did not force unity, he inspired it, and that made all the difference. Soon, what was once a scattered group became something far more dangerous, a collective force with direction. Then came the first true test. Cyrus turned his attention toward the Medes, the very power that had long controlled his people. This was not just a rebellion. This was a challenge to an established empire. From the outside, it seemed impossible. The Medes were stronger, more experienced, and already in control. But what they lacked was what Cyrus had built: loyalty and belief. The conflict that followed was not just a clash of armies, it was a clash of systems. On one side stood an empire built on control. On the other stood a rising force built on unity. And slowly, unexpectedly, the balance began to shift. Victory did not come in a single moment. It came through strategy, through persistence, and through the ability to turn weaknesses into strength. And when it was over, the unimaginable had happened. The Persians had not just resisted, they had taken control. But Cyrus did something no one expected. He did not destroy the Medes. He did not erase their identity or punish them into submission. Instead, he absorbed them. He allowed their systems, their people, and their strengths to become part of something larger. This was not conquest as the world knew it. This was transformation. And in that decision, Cyrus revealed the true nature of his vision. He was not building an empire based solely on domination. He was building something far more powerful, an empire that could include, adapt, and grow without collapsing under its own weight. With the Medes now part of his expanding power, Cyrus was no longer just a leader of Persians. He was the ruler of a new and rapidly growing force. And for the first time, the great powers of the world began to notice. But by the time they realized what was happening, Cyrus was already moving. His gaze shifted westward, toward Lydia, toward Babylon, toward a future that no one could yet fully understand. Because what had begun as a quiet rise in a forgotten land was now turning into something unstoppable. An empire was forming, not slowly, not cautiously, but with a momentum that would soon reshape the entire known world. And the next step he would take would not just expand his power. It would change history forever, the empire that could not be stopped. And the next step he would take would not just expand his power, it would change history forever. By now, Cyrus was no longer a rising leader hidden in the shadows of greater empires. He had become something far more dangerous, something the world had not seen before. A ruler who did not simply conquer land, but reshaped the very idea of power itself. His name had begun to travel across regions, carried by merchants, whispered by soldiers, and feared by kings who had once believed their dominance would never be challenged. But the world he faced was still filled with giants. To the west stood Lydia, one of the richest kingdoms of its time, a land known for its immense wealth, especially its gold. Its ruler, Cyrus, was not just a king, he was a symbol of power and prosperity. His confidence was unmatched, his resources vast, and his belief in his own strength unshakable. For him, Cyrus was nothing more than a rising threat that needed to be dealt with before it grew any further. But Croesus made one critical mistake. He underestimated not just Cyrus, but the kind of force he had become. When the conflict began, it was expected to be a straightforward display of strength. Lydia had wealth, trained armies, and established dominance. Persia, though growing rapidly, was still seen as the challenger. But Cyrus did not fight like the kings before him. He did not rely solely on numbers or tradition. He adapted, he observed. He turned the battlefield itself into a weapon. The clash between the two forces was not just a test of power, it was a test of thinking. Cyrus understood something that many rulers ignored. Victory was not always about overwhelming strength. Sometimes it was about breaking the confidence of your enemy. And in the decisive moments of the campaign, that is exactly what he did. Through strategy and unexpected tactics, he dismantled the certainty that Lydia had built its power upon. And, when the dust settled, Lydia had fallen. The richest kingdom of its time was now part of Cyrus's expanding empire. But once again, he did something no one expected. He did not destroy it. He preserved it. Its systems, its people, its wealth, all became part of something larger. Cyrus was not leaving behind ruins. He was building continuity. Every victory made him stronger, not just in territory, but in structure. And with each step forward, his empire became more stable, more connected, and more unstoppable. Now, the world began to realize the truth. This was no longer a rising power. This was a force that could not be ignored. And yet, even after Lydia, one giant still remained: Babylon, a city unlike any other, massive, fortified, and filled with history, culture, and influence. Its walls were legendary, its defenses considered impenetrable, and its reputation unmatched. For centuries, Babylon had stood as a symbol of civilization itself. To challenge it was to challenge the very heart of the ancient world. But Cyrus did not hesitate, because by now his vision had grown far beyond survival or dominance. He was no longer simply expanding an empire. He was reshaping the world into something unified, something connected, something that could hold together cultures that had once been divided. The march toward Babylon was not rushed. It was calculated. Every movement, every decision, every alliance was part of a larger plan. And when the moment finally came, the world expected a brutal siege, a long and destructive battle that would shake the region. But once again, Cyrus changed the rules. Instead of attacking Babylon in the way everyone expected, he used strategy that bypassed its greatest strengths. He did not break the walls, he went around them. He turned the environment itself into an advantage, redirecting the flow of the Euphrates River and allowing his forces to enter the city through paths that were never meant to be used in war. And just like that, Babylon fell, not through destruction, but through brilliance. It was one of the most shocking moments in history. A city believed to be untouchable had been taken with minimal chaos. And when Cyrus entered Babylon, he did not present himself as a destroyer. He presented himself as a liberator. He respected the traditions of the people. He allowed them to continue their way of life. He restored temples, honored beliefs, and gave freedom where others would have imposed control. This was not conquest in the traditional sense. This was something entirely different. And in that moment, Cyrus became more than a king. He became a symbol of a new kind of rule, one where power did not come from fear alone, but from respect, inclusion, and vision. His empire now stretched across vast lands, connecting cultures, languages, and peoples in a way that had never been done before. From the edges of India to the borders of the Greek world, from the mountains to the deserts, everything was now part of a single system. The Persian Empire, the largest the world had ever seen at that time. And yet, at the height of this power, at the peak of what seemed like an unstoppable rise, something else was quietly approaching, because history does not move in one direction forever. Every rise carries within it the shadow of a future fall. And even though Cyrus had built something extraordinary, something that changed the world, the question was no longer how far the empire could expand. The question was, what would happen when the man who created it was no longer there? Because the moment he was gone, the future of everything he built would begin to change. When the empire lost its center, because the moment he was gone, the future of everything he built would begin to change. For years, Cyrus had been more than a ruler. He had been the center of balance, the force that held together something incredibly complex. His empire was not just large, it was diverse, filled with different cultures, languages, beliefs, and systems that somehow coexisted under one rule. And that rule worked, not because of fear alone, but because of the way he led. He understood people, he respected traditions, and he knew how to unite differences instead of crushing them. But when a system depends too much on one man, his absence does not create a gap, it creates instability. And that is exactly what began to happen. When Cyrus died, the empire did not collapse immediately. From the outside, everything still looked powerful. The borders remained vast, the armies still strong, and the administration continued to function. But beneath that surface, something had shifted. The invisible force that once held everything together was gone. His son, Cambyses, took the throne. He inherited not just an empire, but a legacy that was almost impossible to carry. And from the very beginning, the weight of that responsibility began to show. Cambyses was not Cyrus. He did not have the same patience, the same vision, or the same ability to balance power with understanding. Where Cyrus had built trust, Cambyses often ruled with force. Where Cyrus had unified, Cambyses struggled to maintain control. Yet, he was not weak. In fact, he expanded the empire further, pushing into Egypt and bringing one of the oldest civilizations under Persian rule. This should have strengthened the empire, should have solidified its dominance even further. But expansion without stability is dangerous. And as Cambyses moved further away from the center of power, the foundation he stood on began to weaken. Rumors started to spread, stories of instability, stories of harsh decisions, stories that slowly eroded confidence. And in an empire as vast as Persia, perception mattered as much as reality, because once people begin to question power, power itself begins to change. While Cambyses was away, focused on conquest, something unexpected happened back home. A figure emerged, claiming authority, claiming legitimacy, and for many, offering an alternative to uncertainty. Whether he was a true heir or an impostor did not matter as much as what he represented: a shift in loyalty. And just like that, the empire faced something it had not experienced since before Cyrus. Internal division, not from enemies at the borders, but from within. Cambyses rushed back, but the situation was already slipping beyond control, and before he could fully reclaim his position, his life came to an end suddenly, and under circumstances that would remain surrounded by uncertainty. Some say it was an accident. Others believe it was something more, but regardless of how it happened, the result was the same. The empire was now without a clear center, and when power becomes unclear, chaos finds its way in. For a brief moment, it seemed like everything Cyrus had built might unravel completely. Multiple claims to the throne, shifting loyalties, confusion spreading across regions that had once been united under a single vision. The system was still there, the structure still existed, but the stability was gone. And then, another man stepped forward. Darius. Unlike Cyrus, he was not the founder. Unlike Cambyses, he did not inherit power directly in a moment of strength. He rose during instability, during uncertainty, during a time when the empire was vulnerable. And because of that, his role would be different. He did not just need to rule, he needed to restore. Through strategy, alliances, and force where necessary, Darius managed to reclaim control and stabilize the empire. But he understood something that neither Cyrus nor Cambyses had fully faced. The empire had grown too large to rely on one man alone. It needed systems, it needed structure, it needed organization that could survive beyond any single ruler. And so he transformed it. He divided the empire into provinces, each governed but still connected to a central authority. He built roads that allowed communication to travel faster than ever before, linking distant lands into a single functioning system. He standardized systems of taxation, creating order where there had once been variation, and in doing so, he strengthened the empire in a way that made it even more powerful than before. Under Darius, Persia reached new heights, not just in size, but in efficiency, not just in power, but in control. From the outside, it looked like the empire had recovered completely, perhaps even improved. And in many ways, it had. The structure was stronger, the systems more advanced, and the reach of Persian influence extended further than ever before. But something had changed. The empire was no longer held together by a shared vision. It was held together by structure. And structure, no matter how strong, does not replace unity. Because while Darius was building roads, organizing provinces, and strengthening administration, something else was slowly forming beyond the borders. A new kind of resistance. Not from within the empire, but from those who refused to be part of it. To the west, smaller but fiercely independent regions were watching, studying, waiting. They did not have the size of Persia. They did not have its wealth or its numbers. But they had something else. A different way of thinking. A different approach to power. And eventually, these worlds would collide. Not as a simple expansion. Not as another conquest, but as a conflict that would define the future. Because for the first time, the Persian Empire would face an enemy it could not easily absorb. An enemy that would not become part of it. An enemy that would challenge it in a way no one had before. And when that moment arrived, it would not just test the strength of Persia, it would reveal its limits. When the world fought back, and when that moment arrived, it would not just test the strength of Persia, it would reveal its limits. For decades, the Persian Empire had expanded in a way the world had never seen before. It did not simply conquer land, it absorbed it, connected it, and turned it into something greater than its individual parts. From distant deserts to fertile valleys, from ancient cities to newly formed provinces, everything had become part of a single system. And under rulers like Darius, that system had become even more organized, more efficient, and more powerful. From the outside, it appeared unstoppable, a force so vast that no single opponent could ever hope to challenge it. But history has a way of balancing power, often in the most unexpected ways. And in this case, that balance began to form far to the west, in lands that seemed insignificant compared to the massive reach of Persia. These were not unified empires, not vast kingdoms with endless resources, but small, independent city-states scattered across the Greek world. Individually, they were nothing compared to Persia. Their armies were smaller, their territories limited, and their internal divisions constant. Yet, within that apparent weakness, there was something Persia had not yet faced. They could not be easily controlled. They could not be easily absorbed. And more importantly, they did not think the same way. While Persia had built its strength through unity under centralized authority, these Greek city-states valued independence above all else. Each city saw itself as its own world, with its own identity, its own pride, and its own determination to remain free. This difference in thinking would become the foundation of a conflict far greater than any simple battle for territory. At first, the connection between these two worlds seemed distant. Persia had extended its influence into regions near the Greek sphere, bringing some areas under its control. But controlling land was not the same as controlling spirit. And when certain Greek cities in Asia Minor found themselves under Persian rule, tension began to grow. These cities were not comfortable being part of something larger. They resisted, they questioned, and eventually they revolted. This revolt was not massive in scale, but it carried a deeper meaning. It was not just about control, it was about identity. And when these cities sought support, some of the mainland Greek powers responded. Small acts of assistance, limited involvement, but enough to draw attention. From the perspective of Persia, this was more than a minor disturbance. It was a challenge, not because it threatened the empire's existence, but because it questioned its authority. And in an empire built on the idea of unified control, even a small challenge could not be ignored. Darius understood this. He did not see Greece as it appeared on the surface. He saw it as a potential source of ongoing resistance, a region that could disrupt the stability of his empire if left unchecked. And so, he made a decision that would set the stage for one of the most important conflicts in history. He turned his attention westward. The goal was not simply conquest. It was control, stability, and the elimination of future threats. But what followed would be far from simple. When Persian forces moved toward Greece, they did so with the confidence of an empire that had never truly been stopped. Their armies were vast, their resources immense, and their experience unmatched. They had defeated larger powers, absorbed stronger kingdoms, and built a system that had proven its effectiveness time and time again. But Greece was different. Not because it was stronger, but because it refused to become part of something else. The first major confrontation came in a place that would become legendary: Marathon. Here, a Persian force landed with the expectation of a decisive victory. The Greek response, however, was unexpected. Instead of waiting, instead of negotiating, they confronted the Persian army directly. Their numbers were smaller, their resources limited, but their determination was absolute. What followed was not just a battle, it was a statement. Against all expectations, the Greeks pushed back. They fought with a unity that they rarely showed among themselves, driven not by expansion, but by defense of their independence. And in that moment, something happened that the world had never seen before. The Persian advance was stopped. Not completely, not permanently, but enough to change perception. For the first time, the idea that Persia could be resisted became real. Darius did not live to see the full continuation of this conflict, but the stage had already been set. The tension between these two worlds had grown beyond a single battle. It had become something larger, something inevitable. And when his successor, Xerxes, took the throne, he inherited not just an empire, but a challenge that demanded resolution. Xerxes did not intend to repeat the past. He intended to end it. The scale of preparation was unlike anything seen before. Massive forces gathered, bridges constructed across vast waters, supply lines organized with precision. This was not a simple campaign. This was an overwhelming display of power, designed to ensure that no resistance could stand against it. When the invasion began, it was meant to be final. But once again, Greece responded in a way Persia did not fully expect. At Thermopylae, a narrow passage became the setting for one of the most symbolic stands in history. A small force, vastly outnumbered, chose not to retreat. They chose to stand, knowing the outcome, understanding the cost, but refusing to give way. From a strategic perspective, it was a delay. From a symbolic perspective, it was everything, because it showed that resistance was not about victory alone. It was about refusal. The conflict continued, moving from land to sea, from one engagement to another. Battles like Salamis revealed something critical. Persia's strength, while immense, was not absolute. Its size, once its greatest advantage, could also become a limitation. Coordination became more complex, decisions more difficult, and adaptability more challenging. The Greeks, despite their divisions, found moments of unity when it mattered most, and in those moments they were able to push back against a force that should have been impossible to resist. Over time, the momentum began to shift, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough to create a new reality. Persia was still powerful, still vast, still influential, but no longer unstoppable. And that change, that single shift in perception, would echo far beyond these battles. Because once an empire is seen as vulnerable, the world begins to treat it differently. Allies reconsider, enemies grow bolder, and internal confidence begins to weaken. The Persian Empire did not collapse after these conflicts. It continued. It endured. But something fundamental had changed. The illusion of invincibility was gone, and in its place, a new chapter of history was beginning, one where Persia would no longer be the uncontested center of power, one where new forces would rise, shaped by the very resistance that had begun here. And, somewhere beyond the horizon, another figure was already growing, watching, learning, preparing. A man who would not just challenge Persia, but bring its greatest era to an end. And when he arrived, the story would take a turn no one could have predicted. The man who broke an empire. And somewhere beyond the horizon, another figure was already growing, watching, learning, preparing, while Persia was still vast, still powerful, and still standing as one of the greatest empires the world had ever seen. Something had quietly changed. The battles against the Greeks had not destroyed Persia, but they had exposed something that could never be unseen again. The empire could be challenged, it could be resisted, and more importantly, it could be studied. In the lands of Macedonia, far to the west of Persia, a young boy was growing up in the shadow of these stories. He listened to tales of great battles, of massive armies, of a kingdom so powerful that it stretched across continents. But unlike others who heard these stories with fear or admiration, he heard them with something different: curiosity. His name was Alexander. From an early age, he was not trained just to rule, but to think, to question, and to understand the nature of power itself. Under the guidance of one of the greatest minds of the time, he learned not only about warfare, but about philosophy, strategy, and the deeper forces that shaped human history. He did not simply want to inherit a kingdom. He wanted to surpass everything that came before him. And Persia stood as the ultimate challenge. By the time Alexander took the throne, he was young, but far from inexperienced. He had already proven himself in battle, already demonstrated his ability to lead, and already built a sense of loyalty among his men that would become one of his greatest strengths. But what he planned next was beyond anything expected of a king his age. He would march east, not to defend, not to negotiate, but to conquer. When Alexander set his sights on Persia, many saw it as ambition beyond reason. Persia was still massive, still rich, still filled with resources and armies that dwarfed anything Macedonia could assemble. The idea of defeating such an empire was not just difficult, it seemed impossible. But Alexander did not see impossibility. He saw opportunity. The first major encounter came at the Battle of Granicus, where Alexander faced Persian forces for the first time on a large scale. It was here that he made something clear not just to his enemies, but to his own men. He would not lead from behind. He would fight at the front, risking his life alongside those who followed him. This was not just strategy, this was inspiration. And it worked. The victory at Granicus was not just a military success. It was a signal. Persia had been challenged again, but this time by something far more dangerous than before. This was not a collection of resisting cities or independent states. This was a unified force led by a single vision, moving with speed, precision, and determination. As Alexander advanced, city after city fell. Some resisted, others surrendered, but the pattern was becoming clear. This was not a slow campaign. This was momentum, and with each victory, that momentum grew stronger. Then came the Battle of Issus. For the first time, Alexander faced the Persian king himself, Darius III. This was more than a battle. This was a direct confrontation between two worlds, two systems, two visions of power. Darius commanded a massive army, far larger than Alexander's forces. On paper, the outcome should have been clear. But battles are not won on paper. They are won through leadership, strategy, and the ability to adapt in the moment. Alexander moved with precision, targeting weaknesses, breaking formations, and creating chaos where there had once been order. And in the decisive moment, something happened that would change everything. Darius fled. The king of Persia, the ruler of one of the greatest empires in history, turned away from the battlefield. And in that moment, the psychological balance shifted completely, because an empire can survive the loss of a battle. But the loss of confidence is far more dangerous. Alexander continued his march, now not just as a challenger, but as a force that could not be stopped. Egypt fell into his control, welcoming him as a liberator. His influence spread rapidly, and with each step, he moved closer to the heart of Persia itself. The final turning point came at the Battle of Gaugamela. This was meant to be the decisive stand. Darius gathered everything he had left, assembling a force designed to end Alexander's advance once and for all. The battlefield was prepared, the numbers overwhelming, the stakes absolute. If Persia won, the empire would be preserved. If Persia lost, everything would change. And when the battle began, it carried the weight of centuries. Alexander, once again, relied on speed, strategy, and precision. He did not try to overpower the Persian army. He broke it apart. He created openings, exploited weaknesses, and forced the battle into moments that favored his strengths. And once again, Darius fled. This time, there was no recovery. This time, there was no second chance. The heart of the Persian Empire was now exposed. Cities that had once stood as symbols of power fell into Alexander's hands. And eventually, he reached Persepolis, the ceremonial capital, a place that represented the glory, wealth, and identity of Persia itself. What happened there remains one of the most symbolic moments in history. The city was burned. Whether as an act of revenge, a display of power, or a decision driven by impulse, the result was the same. The center of Persian greatness was reduced to flames, its legacy scarred in a way that would never be forgotten. In that moment, it was clear. The empire that Cyrus had built, the system that Darius had strengthened, the power that had once dominated the known world, was no longer in control of its own future. Alexander did not just defeat Persia, he absorbed it. He took its lands, its systems, and its influence, merging them into something new. In many ways, he continued what Cyrus had started, but under a different name, a different vision, and a different legacy. And yet, even in defeat, Persia did not truly disappear. Because empires are not just defined by their rulers or their armies, they are defined by their ideas. And those ideas, they survived, they adapted, they waited. Because history, as it had shown before, does not end with one fall. It transforms. And while Alexander had brought an end to one era, he had also unknowingly set the stage for another, because the land of Persia was not finished. It was not silent. It was only changing. And the story was far from over. The empire that never truly ended. And the story was far from over. Because what Alexander defeated was not just an empire of land and armies. What he touched, what he reshaped, and what he unknowingly carried forward was something far deeper. Persia had never been only about power in the way the world understood it. It had never been just about conquest, borders, or kings sitting on thrones of gold. It was an idea, a system, a way of connecting people, cultures, and identities across vast distances in a way that had never been done before. And ideas do not burn as easily as cities. When Alexander took control of Persia, he did not erase it. In many ways, he became part of it. He adopted elements of Persian culture, wore its symbols, and tried to rule not as an outsider, but as a continuation of something greater. This was not a coincidence. It was a reflection of how deeply Persia had shaped the structure of power itself. Even in defeat, it influenced those who replaced it. But Alexander's empire, like many that rise too quickly, did not hold together for long after his death. Without his presence, without the force that held it unified, it fractured into pieces, divided among generals who could not maintain the same vision. And in that fragmentation, something important happened. The land of Persia remained. Empires came and went above it. Rulers changed, names shifted, but the foundation stayed. The memory of what had once existed did not disappear. It lived in traditions, in governance, in the way power was organized, and in the identity of the people who continued to inhabit that land. Over time, new Persian empires would rise again. The Parthians, the Sassanids, each one different, each one shaped by its time, but all carrying echoes of the same origin. This was not a simple continuation, it was evolution. Because Persia was no longer just one empire, it had become a legacy that adapted to survive. Even as new forces emerged, even as new beliefs spread, even as the world around it transformed, this land continued to remain relevant. It absorbed change without losing itself completely. It transformed without disappearing. And that ability, that resilience, became its greatest strength. Centuries passed. The world changed in ways that no ancient ruler could have imagined. New empires rose in different regions. New ideas reshaped societies. Technologies advanced, borders shifted, and the pace of history accelerated. And through all of it, the land once known as Persia continued to exist, not always at the center of power, not always dominating the world, but never truly fading into irrelevance. Its name changed. Its systems changed. Its place in the global order changed. But its story did not end. Because history is not a straight line. It moves in cycles. Power rises, falls, and rises again in different forms. Influence shifts from one place to another, but it rarely disappears completely. And when you look closely, you begin to notice patterns, echoes of the past appearing in the present, reminders that what once was can still shape what is. The land, now called Iran, carries within it layers of that history. Beneath modern cities lie ancient foundations. Beneath current identities lie older ones that have been reshaped, not erased. The same geography that once connected civilizations still exists. The same position that made it central in the ancient world still gives it significance today. This is why the world watches, not because of a single moment, not because of one event, but because this land has always been part of something larger. It has been a crossroads of power, a center of influence, a place where the direction of history has shifted more than once. And when something has played that role for so long, people learn to pay attention when it begins to move again. What we are seeing today is not isolated from the past. It is connected to it in ways that are not always obvious, but always present. The same dynamics that shaped ancient empires, power, identity, influence, resistance still exist, just in different forms. The scale has changed, the tools have evolved, but the underlying patterns remain. And this is where the story becomes more than history. It becomes perspective, because when you understand where something comes from, you begin to see it differently. You begin to recognize that what appears sudden is often the result of a long process, that what seems new may actually be a continuation of something much older, and that the present is never truly separate from the past. The rise of Persia was not an accident. It was the result of conditions, decisions, and ideas coming together at the right time. Its expansion was not just about strength, but about innovation in how power was organized. Its fall was not simply defeat, but a shift that allowed new forces to emerge. And its survival, in different forms across centuries, is proof that some legacies are too deeply rooted to disappear. So when we ask why the world is watching again, the answer is not found in a single explanation. It is found in history itself, because this is not the first time this land has stood at a turning point. It is not the first time it has been at the center of attention, and it may not be the last. The story of Iran is not just about what it was, it is about what it represents. A reminder that power can rise from unexpected places. A reminder that even the greatest empires can fall. And a reminder that some stories, no matter how many times they seem to end, never truly do. And perhaps the most important part of this entire story is this. We are not just looking at history, we are watching it continue. If this story made you see history differently, then you're already ahead of most people, because the past is not behind us. It's all around us. And before you go, tell me, from where are you watching this video, and what time is it in your country? And if you want more stories like this, deep, real, and untold, make sure you stay with me, because the next story might change how you see the world again.